She sheltered a stranger during the storm. By morning the kingdom knew her name. Autumn came to Fenwick House as a creditor, not a season. It rattled the loosened casements with a collector's insistence, pushed rain beneath the warped frames, and prowled the corridors as if it meant to inspect every failing beam before the lawyers did. In the West Passage, where the wallpaper had once borne climbing roses and now showed only damp stains the color of tea, Eleanor Marlowe set a row of copper bowls beneath the steady drips from the ceiling and listened to the storm count the seconds of her dwindling inheritance. She wore the plain dove-gray gown that no one in the district ever remembered afterward, because it was the sort of dress that left no impression except neatness. That had long been the story of Eleanor herself. Men addressed their brighter thoughts to other women. Neighbors recalled her late father, her handsome house, her losses, her unfortunate economy, and then, after a pause, remembered that there had also been a daughter in the rooms all along. Her aunt, Mrs. Valeria Marlowe, had gone to bed before 9 with a complaint about the chill and the butcher's account. The last two maids were asleep in the attic. The cook had banked the kitchen fire. Only Eleanor remained awake, moving quietly through the old house with a candle in one hand and a ledger in the other, as though the right arrangement of wax, ink, and perseverance might hold ruin outside the gates until Christmas. It was a habit of hers to make lists when frightened. Coal remaining, flour remaining, rent still unpaid by tenants who could not pay because their own fields had drowned in August, linen too worn to survive another season, silver that might be sold, paint that could not be afforded, hope unlisted because it had grown too expensive to count. At the eastern stair she stopped and listened. Wind pressed along the roofline with the long groan of something human and disappointed. Beyond it she could hear the lane rushing like a black river. On nights such as this, when the hedges vanished and the road became guesswork, her father had always insisted that a blue glass storm lantern be hung in the front window to guide travelers away from the flooded ditch below the yews. He had said that if a house possessed light, then refusing to share it in bad weather was a kind of meanness no prayer could wash clean. After his death, nobody had remembered the custom except Eleanor. She remembered it now. She trimmed the wick herself, lifted the old brass lantern by its warm handle, and set it glowing in the front hall window where its cobalt light turned the rain beyond the glass into a wavering blue veil. For a moment she stood beside it and saw her own reflection. Oval face, chestnut hair arranged as plainly as practicality allowed, gray-blue eyes tired but steady, and thought that she looked less like the daughter of the house than its last employed guardian. The storm worked at the old house with patient fingers. It found every weakness time had made, every crack the mason had meant to mend in summer, and every window latch that had held only because no one had tested it. Eleanor moved through that siege without drama. She caught the leaks. She banked the nursery grate, though no child had slept there in years. She sent the last kitchen maid to her bed before midnight because tired girls made mistakes with fire, and fire would finish what debt had begun. There was no applause for any of it. Competence rarely drew witnesses. It simply kept disaster from becoming visible enough for others to name. At 11:30, when she returned to the small morning room to compare the butcher's figures against the cook's written list, a knock sounded at the door. It was not the brisk rap of a servant or the urgent hammering of a man in authority. It was a single blow, then another, separated by the kind of silence that suggested the caller was choosing between stubbornness and collapse. Eleanor froze with the candle raised. Fenwick had not lately seen callers at that hour except debt men, and debt men did not hesitate. Another knock came, softer than the first. Then nothing. She crossed the hall before she could be stopped by Prudence. The bolts were old and loud. When she opened the door, the wind struck inward hard enough to make the nearest candle bow flat. A man stood on the threshold, one shoulder braced against the frame as if he had reached it only because pride had carried him the last yard after strength failed. His dark cloak was soaked almost black. Rain ran from the brim of his hat. One gloved hand gripped the doorpost. The other, ungloved, was wrapped clumsily in linen already stained through at the palm. "I beg your pardon," he said, and his voice was low, educated, and worn thin by cold. "My horse threw me 1/2 mile back. I saw the lantern. If I might have shelter until the storm eases, I will trouble you no further than the hall. It was the sort of request a sensible woman alone in a failing house ought to have refused. Eleanor knew that even as she stepped aside. Sensible women, however, were often helped by the existence of footmen, brothers, fathers, or secure fortunes. Eleanor had none of those at hand, only an old custom, a blue lantern, and a man whose face had gone nearly colorless beneath the rain. "You will not stand in my hall and freeze," she said. "Come in before the wind tears the hinges off the door." He entered with a stiffness that told her pain had been mastered, not diminished. Up close he looked to be in his early 30s, tall even while half-bent with exhaustion, with the grave, controlled expression of a man long accustomed to governing himself more strictly than comfort required. Wet dark hair clung at his temples. His features might have been called handsome if one were in the habit of admiring beauty that had been disciplined nearly out of sight. Strong nose, hard line of mouth, eyes the uncertain color of whiskey held up to fire. Those eyes flicked once around the hall, not in vulgar assessment, but in quick instinctive calculation, as if he meant to understand the house before the house understood him. "Your hand," Eleanor said. "A shallow cut. I lost my seat, not my life. Then let us preserve both." She took the cloak from his shoulders before he could object and felt the surprising weight of water in it. "The drawing-room fire is small but honest. I can offer tea, dry linen, and if the storm continues, a bedchamber that does not face the worst of the wind." His expression changed by a degree so slight another woman might have missed it. Surprise first, then something more careful than gratitude, as though kindness from strangers made him uneasy because it asked nothing visible in return. "You are very generous," he said. "No, only practical. You would drip to death in my entrance if I left you there." That drew the faintest breath of laughter from him, vanishing almost before it formed. He followed her into the green drawing-room, where the walls had faded to moss and gold and the fire, though not grand, still held enough warmth to make the room inhabitable. She set the candle down, stirred the coals, and added 2 split logs. He stood with one hand at the mantel, motionless except for the tremor that ran once through his shoulders when heat first reached him. She saw then that the cut in his palm had been made by something sharper than a fall alone. The linen was tied like a field dressing, competent but hurried. "Sit," she said. "I would rather not stain your carpet. It is already ruined in 3 places by damp and 1 by claret. You will not finish what time began. Please." He obeyed that time, easing himself into the chair nearest the fire. Eleanor rang the bell for no one, remembered that everyone sane was in bed, and without embarrassment fetched the tea tray herself from the sideboard. She had done too many things alone to blush at the evidence of it. While the kettle reheated on the hob, she knelt beside his chair with fresh linen and the basin she used for polishing silver, now filled with warm water. "If you faint," she said, "I shall consider it a poor compliment to my housekeeping." He looked at her then with a steadiness that would have been intimidating if it had not been so tired. "I do not faint." "Then hold still." The cut crossed the fleshy part of his palm in a slant, clean-edged and deeper than he had admitted. Not dangerous, but painful, particularly in cold rain. His hands were not the hands of a clerk or scholar, though the nails were well kept. There was old strength in the fingers, riding strength and fencing strength, and 1 pale scar at the base of the thumb that looked years old. Eleanor cleaned the wound without ceremony. He did not flinch until she drew the last grit from it, and then only in the tightening of his jaw. "You are accustomed to being obeyed," she said before she thought better of it. One brow lifted. "Am I?" "You sit like a man who expects pain to be temporary and contradiction to be rare." If the remark offended him, no offense reached his face. Instead, that near-invisible humor returned. "And you bind wounds like a field surgeon disguised as a clergyman's daughter." "Magistrate's daughter," she said, tying the linen securely. "My father believed the village doctor overworked and underpaid. He invited him to supper and then bullied him into teaching me enough to keep children from fevers and men from losing fingers to stupidity. A useful education. More useful than drawing-room Italian." She rose to pour the tea. "You may tell me your name now that I have prevented you from bleeding on the upholstery." There was the briefest pause. "Reed," he said. "Adrian Reed." The name settled too neatly, like a coin laid down with care. She knew at once it was not the whole truth. Yet she was not frightened by the concealment. Storms brought all sorts of men to doors, and some had reason enough for guarding what they were called. "Miss Eleanor Marlowe," she replied. Though in weather like this, titles matter less than hot tea. She carried him a cup. His uninjured hand closed around it with obvious relief. The steam rose between them, carrying the modest scent of bergamot and worn silver. For a time only the storm spoke. Rain worried the windows. Wind moved in the chimney. Somewhere above, a shutter banged and then was still. The fire in the green drawing room was not grand enough for performance. It was the kind of fire people used when they wished only to be warm, not impressive, and that distinction mattered to Eleanor more than she would have admitted. She had spent too many years watching comfort arranged for show. Great tables set for guests while servants mended shoes in cold corridors. Candles burned in chandeliers while the schoolroom had only tallow stubs. Beside that smaller hearth she felt, if not safe, at least truthful. Adrian seemed altered by it as well. Stripped of entourage, title, and polished distance. He was only a man whose hand had once bled on her floor, and who now turned a teacup slowly in his fingers as if warmth were a thing he had forgotten how to trust. He drank as if mindful of his manners even on the edge of collapse. That, more than his coat or speech, persuaded her he was no common traveler. Men who had never been denied servants often moved with a particular economy of gesture, as though wasting motion was a kind of vulgarity. This one possessed that habit, though the storm had stripped away the ease that usually disguised it. "You said your horse threw you," Eleanor said. "He found the lane less trustworthy than I had." A sensible conclusion, and yet you continued on foot. The nearest inn had flooded by dusk. "I saw light here and preferred your judgment to drowning." An unflattering compliment, but I shall keep it. This time the smile did not vanish immediately. It altered his whole face, not by softening it but by revealing that severity had not been its natural condition. He had likely smiled often once. That he did not now suggested habit rather than temperament. She noticed his gaze move to the ledgers stacked near the fire. "You work late," he said. "I work whenever the accounts are least capable of arguing with me. Night tends to make them meek. And are they meek tonight? Not remotely. Fenwick spends like an old gentleman determined to deny mortality. I am trying to persuade it toward humility. The house belongs to you? Legally, for the moment. Morally, perhaps to the rain. Financially, to 3 creditors and a solicitor who writes condolences in handwriting expensive enough to be an insult." He set down the teacup. "You speak of ruin very calmly. If I shouted, would the roof mend itself? No. Then calm remains cheaper." He was silent at that, but not idly so. His attention had sharpened. She could almost feel him rearranging her in his mind, moving her from one familiar category to another he had not expected. Eleanor knew the process. People often began by mistaking quiet for vacancy. When they discovered thought beneath it, they behaved either as if they had made a rare find or as if they had been deceived. She had no patience for either reaction. To keep him awake until the chill passed, she asked practical questions about the road, the ford, whether he had struck his head when he fell. His answers were precise and never quite expansive. He had been traveling from the north. He preferred to ride without an escort when weather allowed. He had underestimated both the lane and the storm. He did not mention destination, relations, or profession. Yet when the hall clock struck midnight and a tremor of pain crossed his face before he hit it, Eleanor said simply, "You will not return to the road tonight. I have already asked too much. You have asked for shelter. That is not the same thing. There is a bedchamber at the back of the house no one uses in winter because the wallpaper frightens my aunt. It is dry and the sheets are clean. If you leave now, I shall have wasted good bandages." He looked toward the rain-lashed windows. Something in his expression closed, then opened by deliberate choice. "Very well. If I remain under obligation." "Nonsense. Under blankets." She stood and took up the candle again. "Can you manage the stairs?" He managed them with a reserve that cost him obvious effort. At the landing he paused, not from weakness, she thought, but from the instinct of a man who never willingly turned his back in an unfamiliar house. She showed him the chamber herself. It had a narrow bed, a walnut chest, a washstand, and curtains patched so neatly one had to look twice to see the mending. She laid out one of her father's dry nightshirts and a wool robe. "I cannot repay this tonight," he said from the doorway. "Then do not try. Sleep first. Accounts may be settled in better weather." He looked as if he meant to answer more personally than before, but some habit of caution held him. "Good night, Miss Marlowe. Good night, Mr. Reed." She left him there and went downstairs with the curious sensation that the house had shifted on its foundations. Not because a stranger slept beneath her roof. Fenwick had seen strangers before. Lawyers, bidders, tradesmen, men with pens and plans. This was different. Something in the discipline of him, and in the surprise he had not entirely hidden at being cared for without ceremony, had entered her thoughts like a splinter of light under a closed door. She did not sleep. There was too much to do before dawn. One shutter had broken loose. Pantry latch required rope. Mrs. Valeria would wake peevish and hungry and alarmed by any novelty. Eleanor moved through the remaining hours with the steady efficiency that had become her answer to helplessness. Yet at odd intervals she found herself listening for footfalls overhead or remembering the way his voice had gone softer around the word shelter, as though the concept belonged more properly to memory than experience. Near 4 o'clock the storm finally began to spend itself. The wind grew less vindictive. Rain slackened from assault to persistence. Eleanor checked the front window and saw the blue lantern still burning, haloed faintly in the thinning dark. Pleased her unreasonably. The house might fail elsewhere, but that light had held. At dawn she was in the breakfast room with the account books open and a fresh pot of tea waiting when hoofbeats sounded in the courtyard. Not one horse. Several. The yard, viewed from the narrow window, filled at once with movement. Mounted men in wet military cloaks, 2 grooms, and a carriage whose lacquered panels had caught the first weak light. A rider dismounted before the horses had properly stopped and strode to the door with the urgency of a man who had spent the night imagining his career ended by disaster. Eleanor had barely reached the hall when pounding shook the panels. Mrs. Valeria appeared on the stairs in a dressing gown trimmed too lavishly for their circumstances. What on earth? Eleanor opened the door. A tall, fair-haired gentleman in travel-stained dark blue bowed sharply, though his eyes were already searching past her into the house. "Madam, forgive the intrusion. We are in pursuit of His Grace the Duke of Redhaven. His horse was found injured near the lower lane. We were told a lantern burned here through the night." Eleanor felt the hall contract around her. Behind her, on the upper landing, a door opened. The man she had known as Adrian Reed descended the stairs with one hand on the banister. He had shaved. He wore her father's plain coat well enough to make it look like a deliberate eccentricity rather than borrowed necessity. Yet nothing in the room altered the way his posture did at the sight of the riders. Weariness remained. Secrecy vanished. Authority entered the house ahead of his next breath. "Lennox," he said. The fair-haired gentleman's expression collapsed into almost painful relief. "Your Grace." Mrs. Valeria gave a small cry. One of the maids, peering from the passage, nearly dropped a breakfast tray. Eleanor stood very still beside the blue lantern and understood, with the odd calm that sometimes accompanies shock, that the storm had not merely brought a stranger to her door. It had brought one of the most discussed men in the kingdom into her ruined hall and placed his life in her hands while she wore a serviceable gray dress and smelled faintly of lamp oil. Adrian, His Grace, turned his gaze to her. Surprise would have humiliated her. Apology might have angered her. What she saw instead was respect sharpened by necessity. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "allow me to present myself more honestly than I did last night. Adrian Thorne, Duke of Redhaven. The fault of concealment was mine." Mrs. Valeria had reached the bottom stair by then and was managing 3 incompatible instincts at once: to curtsy, to calculate, and to scold Eleanor for receiving unknown gentlemen after midnight. Calculation won. Her voice turned honeyed so quickly it might have curdled. "Your Grace, what extraordinary providence! Had we known?" You would have given me the same shelter, he said, in a tone that made the untruth impossible to complete politely. Mrs. Valeria's smile wavered. Captain Lennox, for such Eleanor soon gathered him to be, began a grave account of flooded roads, alarmed stewards, and messages already half dispatched to London because Redhaven House had believed its master injured or worse. Adrian heard him out, then dismissed the greater part of the courtyard bustle with 3 efficient orders. His wound, it seemed, was no public matter, nor was his night's absence to be discussed beyond what necessity compelled. He spoke with such practiced command that every man around him obeyed before remembering to look frightened. Then he asked, with scandalous plainness in front of half the household, whether he might have a private room in which to speak with Miss Marlowe. Mrs. Valeria blanched. Eleanor did not need her aunt's gasp to know what the request sounded like. A gentleman, no, a duke, discovered after spending the night under her roof, now demanding privacy with her before breakfast, while servants and retainers stood witness. By the time the carriage reached the nearest posting inn, the bones of a story would already exist. By noon, flesh would have been added. By evening, society would have dressed it in ribbons and moral concern. Adrian seemed to understand all this at once. His jaw tightened. "The library, if you please," he said, and for the first time his composure showed strain. "With your aunt present if Miss Marlowe prefers." "I prefer the library," Eleanor said. What she preferred, in truth, was not to be discussed like weather in front of strangers. She took up the ledgers almost from instinct and led the way into the room her father had once called the only chamber in Fenwick where Liz felt embarrassed. It was long and narrow, lined in books he had loved more faithfully than most of his acquaintances. Damp had touched the far wall, but the central table remained dry. Mrs. Valeria hovered near the door, lips pursed with offended curiosity. Adrian waited until Lennox had closed them in. Then he spoke without preface. "My presence here has compromised you, so my aunt will insist. Your aunt will be right." His gaze did not shift from Eleanor's face. "I owe you honesty now. I was riding to Fenwick deliberately, though not by the road I intended." That startled her more than his title had. "To Fenwick? Your estate borders 3 Redhaven tenant villages. Your father's final accounts came under review in a land dispute last quarter. I was told the house had been mismanaged by necessity and held together by a daughter no one in London had thought to mention until her figures began correcting older men's assumptions. I wished to see the land for myself before deciding whether to acquire the debt, absorb the holdings, or intervene another way. I chose to travel without heraldry because heraldry teaches people to perform." Mrs. Valeria let out a breath of indignation. "Acquire the debt?" Adrian did not so much as glance at her. "Miss Marlowe, I can settle Fenwick's immediate obligations by the week's end. The cottages on the north edge may be repaired before frost. The schoolroom roof can be made sound. Your late father's legitimate debts can be paid without the scavenging auction presently threatened by Penhest bail." It was not possible, and yet the certainty in his voice made impossibility sound like an accounting error. Eleanor set her hand on the back of a chair because the room had shifted again, differently this time. "Why tell me this now?" she asked. His answer came with visible effort, as if each word had to pass through pride before reaching air. "Because after the night just passed, generosity alone will be misread. And because there is a second truth. My household has expected for months that I will make a marriage aligned with politics, influence, and convenience. I have postponed that choice for reasons which need not trouble you at present. This morning, however, any aid I offer you will be interpreted by precisely the sort of minds that enjoy injury. If I leave Fenwick having spent the night beneath your roof and then settle your debts, you will be accused of bartering your reputation for rescue." Mrs. Valeria clasped her hands. She understood at last. Her eyes brightened with horrid hope. "There is one remedy," Adrian said. Eleanor knew it before he spoke it. Still, the words landed with force. "Marry me." No thunder accompanied the proposal. That belonged to lesser dramas. The storm outside had already spent its grand vocabulary. What remained in the library was quieter and far more dangerous. The dry crackle of paper, Mrs. Valeria's excited breathing, and the long interval in which Eleanor looked at a duke who had slept under her roof, eaten her tea bread, admitted he had come to inspect the bones of her ruined life, and was now offering to alter it beyond recognition before breakfast had properly begun. Any other woman, Mrs. Valeria believed, would have wept with gratitude or grasped with triumph. Eleanor did neither. She thought first of cost, because cost was the true language beneath most rescue. If I refused? She asked. Adrian's face remained composed. Then I would still see Fenwick's debts managed in the least destructive way available to me. I will not punish you for declining, but I cannot protect your name from speculation once the facts of last night spread, and they will spread. Nor can I publicly justify my involvement in your affairs without generating a different form of scandal. Marriage is the cleanest shield I can offer. Clean for whom? The question landed. She saw it in the brief lowering of his lashes. For neither of us entirely, he said. Useful for both. Necessary for you sooner than for me. Mrs. Valeria made an offended movement, as though honesty of that quality were unromantic enough to be indecent. Then let us not pretend it is anything else, Eleanor said. She drew out a chair and sat because standing suggested she might agree in shock, and she preferred to agree, if at all, from equilibrium. You propose a transaction. I am prepared to discuss terms. Mrs. Valeria gasped. Adrian, unexpectedly, looked almost relieved. Very well, he said. First, Fenwick's tenants remain through winter. No family is turned from the cottages to improve the appearance of a ledger. Repairs to the north roofs begin before the first hard frost. Second, the schoolroom at Fenwick continues under Mrs. Bailey and is funded for at least 3 years, whether I live there or no. Third, my aunt receives a settled income sufficient to keep her in comfort, but no authority over Redhaven accounts, staff, or correspondence. Fourth, my father's debts are paid only where they are legitimate. If any claim has been inflated by vultures smelling weakness, it is to be contested. Fifth, if this marriage is to be one of necessity, then necessity will not be used later as a weapon of humiliation. I will not be installed like a charity case and reminded daily of what I lacked before I entered your house. Mrs. Valeria turned pale, then pink, then calculatingly pale again at the mention of her own settlement. Adrian did not interrupt once. Are there more? He asked when Eleanor fell silent. She looked at him steadily. Yes. Truth where it materially concerns my life. Not every confidence a statesman or duke may keep, but truths that determine my conduct, my safety, or my public standing. If I am to stand beside you, I will not stand blindfolded. That was the first demand that visibly cost him something. The stillness around his mouth hardened. For one moment she thought he would refuse. Then very slowly he nodded. I can agree to all but perfection, he said. There may be moments when timing limits what I can tell you immediately. But where the truth governs your position, you shall have it from me before you are forced to learn it elsewhere. On that point I give my word. She believed his word. She did not know why, except that some lies are too small for certain kinds of men, and he looked built for rarer failures. Then I accept, she said. Mrs. Valeria let out the sound of a woman hearing her prayers answered by an accountant. If Adrian had expected feminine tremor or visible awe, he concealed the surprise better than he had concealed his name. He bowed once, not deeply, but with a gravity that made the room feel suddenly ceremonial despite the peeling shelves and damp air. Thank you, he said. Do not thank me yet. We have not survived the wedding. This time the smile came fully, briefly, enough to trouble her. Everything after that occurred with the brutal swiftness reserved for acts meant to outrun gossip. Lennox was dispatched to the village for Mr. Pritchard, the vicar, and for Mrs. Bailey to serve as a respectable witness. A message went at once to Redhaven House. Fenwick's cook, informed that a duke was in the breakfast room and a wedding imminent, nearly sat down on a sack of onions. Mrs. Valeria cried twice, both times in the direction of the silver chest. Eleanor went upstairs to dress and found that she possessed no bridal gown, no sentimental ribbon, and no inclination to mourn the absence of either. She chose a cream muslin walking dress with a properly high fichu, long sleeves, and the only pearl pins her mother had left her. When she looked into the mirror, she did not see a bride. She saw a woman stepping from one uncertainty into another more gilded version of it, carrying as much self-command as she could fit into the space where romance ought to have been. From his perspective, across the landing at the chamber where Lennox insisted on replacing the borrowed coat with respectable traveling clothes, Adrian found it easier to think of cavalry movements than of marriage. Strategy had always steadied him. Feeling did not. Yet while his valet fastened a fresh cravat with reverent hands, he kept remembering the sight of Eleanor kneeling on worn carpet to bind a stranger's palm as if rank were nothing beside injury. He had known women who would have executed kindness more gracefully and spoken it more sweetly. He had never met one who made it feel so free of performance. That freedom unnerved him. It suggested a region of life he had stopped believing in, and belief, once awakened, is more dangerous than hunger. He had not lied about Fenwick. He had intended to inspect the estate, judge its debts, and perhaps place it under Redhaven management before winter ruined the village. What he had not said, because even now the truth felt perilously intimate, was that he had been riding with a letter in his coat pocket. It was 3 years old, written by Mr. Marlowe after a county session, and tucked among papers Adrian kept not from sentiment but from professional respect. In it, the older man had described a boundary dispute, then in a postscript almost as an afterthought mentioned that his daughter Eleanor had untangled the tenant figures in an afternoon after 2 solicitors had confused them for a fortnight. She sees what other people overlook, the letter had said. I suspect life will punish or reward her heavily for that, but I should like, at least once, to see it rewarded. Adrian had remembered the line when Fenwick's distress reached him. He had told himself he rode there for land, duty, and efficiency. The truth was untidier. He wanted to know whether the father had seen accurately. He wanted to know whether the overlooked daughter existed as described in a world that so frequently preferred brighter lies. By 11 o'clock they were married in Fenwick's small chapel before a vicar too astonished to vary his voice from pure duty. Rain still tapped the panes. Mrs. Bailey wept openly. Mrs. Valeria tried to look bereaved and exalted at once. Adrian's signet ring pressed cold against Eleanor's glove as he steadied her over the wet stone threshold. There were no flowers except the last white roses from the parlor bowl, hastily gathered and already bruising at the edges. No music. No promises except those the law required and the silence each of them carried unspoken behind the words. When it was done, Eleanor signed her new name with a hand that did not shake. Eleanor Thorne. The sight of it was stranger than the man beside her. Yet when she looked at him, expecting polite distance, she found his attention resting on the page with an intensity almost private. You need not leave at once if you are fatigued, he said. She understood the courtesy and the danger in it. If she stayed, the house would become antechamber to a life already ended. If she left, there would be no space in which to pretend the change had happened gently. I had rather go before I can be pitied, she said. So would I, he answered. They traveled south that afternoon under a paling sky. Fenwick receded behind them in stripped hedges, wet fields, and the memory of a blue lantern dimming in a hall window. Eleanor sat opposite Adrian in the carriage, her hands folded over a reticule containing exactly 3 things that mattered: her mother's pearls, her father's pocket Bible, and the small key to the ledger drawer no one would need now that Redhaven had purchased the right to solve what she could not. Mrs. Valeria had remained behind long enough to supervise trunks and speak loftily to servants about her future consequence. Lennox rode ahead. The Duke and his Duchess, married less than 4 hours, discussed road conditions and bridge repairs as if intimacy could be indefinitely postponed by sufficient practical language. At the first posting house Adrian asked whether she required broth. At the second he inquired whether the jolt of the wheels had worsened her headache, though she had not mentioned having one. These civilities ought to have seemed negligible. Instead, Eleanor found them almost alarming. Indifference she understood. Grand gallantry she could have distrusted with ease. But a watchfulness so controlled it barely showed itself forced her to imagine depths she would have preferred, for the present, not to imagine at all. Toward evening the carriage climbed the last rise before Redhaven House. The estate appeared in stages. First the iron gates, then a beech avenue glittering with rain, then the house itself, wide and stately and so proportioned in its confidence that Fenwick's patched courage seemed suddenly rustic. Stone terraces stepped down toward formal lawns darkened by weather. Tall windows reflected a strip of clearing sky. Servants gathered under the portico in ranks exact enough to suggest drill more than welcome. Eleanor saw at once that this was not a place one drifted into unnoticed. Here even silence would be expected to observe rules. The butler, Mr. Hargreaves, greeted her with perfect deference and the measured surprise of a man informed that his master's mystery had returned from an overnight disappearance with a wife. Housekeeper Mrs. Greeley curtsied without warmth or hostility, merely with the caution of an experienced commander assessing a new sovereign. Footmen carried in trunks. Lamps flared one by one. Somewhere high above, a clock began to strike the hour, and the sound traveled through the entrance hall with enough gravity to make Eleanor feel that the building kept accounts of its own. Her chamber, adjacent to but not connected with Adrian's, overlooked the east lawn. It was beautiful in the formal way that left no room for the untidiness of actual comfort. Blue silk curtains too heavy for taste. A marble mantel no one had ever leaned against in relief. Chairs designed to flatter whoever sat in them. On the bed lay a folded dressing gown finer than anything she had owned in her life. Beside it, on the table, rested a note in Adrian's hand. If anything is lacking, send word to Mrs. Greeley or to me directly. No request that concerns your ease will be unwelcome. He had signed only a T. It was the sort of note a conscientious guardian might send a timid ward. Eleanor stared at it until the letters blurred. Then she rang for hot water, changed into a dove-gray evening gown with long sleeves and a modest neckline, and went down to dinner because whatever else this marriage was, it would not begin with avoidance. The dining room seemed designed to teach distance its finest manners. A table long enough to host an ambassadorial dispute ran beneath a chandelier of crystal drops that gave beautiful light to cold food. Adrian sat at one end. Eleanor sat at the other. Between them stood candles, silver, polished crystal, and enough empty wood to suggest a treaty line. 3 footmen moved in near silence. Courses appeared, vanished, and reappeared as if the meal were performing itself for an audience too well-bred to object. Adrian asked after the journey. Eleanor answered. She inquired after his hand. He said it would mend. They discussed the north cottages. He informed her that workmen had already been sent to Fenwick. She thanked him. Nothing in the exchange was false. Nothing in it crossed the great bright field of the table between them. When at last she retired, she carried with her not resentment but a species of fatigue sharper than sorrow. She had married a man who had seen her value before others had. That ought to have felt like safety. Instead it felt like standing inside the careful architecture of another person's restraint, admiring the workmanship while freezing slightly in the shade. The first week taught her the customs of Redhaven House by degrees. Breakfast was served in the morning room only if Adrian was away. Otherwise, by habit, it appeared in the small study beside his library, where he took coffee alone among dispatch boxes and estate reports. The housekeeper reviewed stores every Tuesday and expected memorized precision. The cook despised waste but loved butter. Mr. Hargreaves believed emotion should never exceed the temperature of silver polish. The servants addressed Eleanor as Your Grace with impeccable correctness and the inward caution reserved for new rulers, uncertain whether they would prefer tyranny, tears, or neglect. Eleanor preferred work. On the second morning she requested the household accounts. Mrs. Greeley hesitated long enough to make the hesitation rude. Then, perhaps remembering that the new Duchess had come from practical obscurity rather than decorative consequence, she produced 6 ledgers, 3 invoice bundles, and a look that invited defeat. Eleanor opened the first book and found, within 10 pages, coal deliveries entered twice, lamp oil charged to rooms that had stood closed all summer, and a standing order of imported oranges at a frequency better suited to a naval hospital than a single household. She marked each discrepancy in a neat hand and carried the book herself to Adrian's study. He looked up from correspondence with visible surprise. Is something amiss? Only if you object to paying for the same coal twice. She laid the ledger before him and showed the duplicate entries, the exaggerated weights, the carelessly rounded totals. Adrian scanned the page, then the next. By the third, the line between his brows deepened. How long has this been happening? Long enough to furnish someone's nephew with excellent boots. Possibly longer. His mouth twitched. Mrs. Greeley assured me our accounts were sound. They may still be, but they have not been interrogated properly in months. He rose and came around the desk, reading over her shoulder. The simple nearness of him, dark wool brushed clean, the faint scent of rain and starch and sandalwood surrounding him, broke her concentration more than the figures deserved. She moved 1 inch farther from his sleeve. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Yet he did not step back, perhaps because the account book gave them a neutral country in which to stand side by side. Would you care to continue interrogating them? He asked. She turned a page. You did not marry me for my opinions on lamp oil. No, he said. Then, after a beat that seemed to contain more than the word itself, but I am beginning to suspect the marriage may improve by them. He had not meant it tenderly. She heard that, but the honesty beneath it warmed her more than any practiced compliment could have done. Numbers soothed her because they did not flatter. A column either balanced or it did not. Grain either had been bought or it had not. Wages either reached the hands that earned them or vanished into some polished gentleman's explanation. When Eleanor sat with ledgers spread before her, the world lost a little of its arbitrariness. Adrian came to recognize that expression in her. The calm absorption, the small line between her brows, the way she pressed the end of a pencil lightly to her lower lip before writing. He began to leave questions on the blotter before he went out in the morning, not because he needed her correction in every case, though often he did, but because he liked returning in the evening to pages where her neat hand had entered certainty where others would have left fog. By the end of the week she had uncovered enough inefficiency to restore hot broth to the servants' supper, order warmer curtains for the north passage, and pay the village glazier to mend 2 nursery windows that had troubled Mrs. Greeley for years. None of it was heroic. Yet houses, Eleanor knew, were saved less often by dramatic gestures than by faithful noticing. Adrian began to notice her noticing. He found her in the still room asking why the rosemary harvest had been cut short. He found her in the kitchen persuading the cook to send extra bread to a widow at the edge of the estate without humiliating the woman by naming it charity. He found her in the laundry passage speaking to a housemaid with the same grave attention she gave him over ledgers. On one drizzling afternoon, he came in from the stables to discover her crouched on the flagged floor of the outer hall, coaxing an old spaniel to swallow broth after a fit of stomach illness that had alarmed the kennel boy. She looked up, hair loosened slightly at the temples, gray gown darkened at the knees by stone dust, and said only, "He is stubborn, which may save him." Adrian stood there longer than the circumstance required, overcome by the absurd wish that someone had once spoken over him in precisely that tone. Evenings, however, remained formal. He worked late. She read in the library or answered Fenwick correspondence until candles burned low. He never ignored her, yet some inner guard kept him from the easy domestic intimacies that might have made the marriage feel less provisional. Once, passing each other in the gallery after midnight, they paused at the same window to watch moonlight silver the terrace. The moment might have turned confessional in a lesser story. Instead, Adrian said, "The mason reports Fenwick's schoolroom roof can be made sound by month-end," and Eleanor answered, "Mrs. Bailey will sleep for a week when she hears it." Then they went their separate ways like 2 diplomats who had nearly mislaid the terms of a treaty. The coldness was not cruel. Cruelty wounds by intention. This was something else. A disciplined habit of withholding that left no bruise one could point to and yet slowly chilled the heart around it. Eleanor told herself she preferred honesty to ardor. She reminded herself that she had entered the marriage with clear eyes, with negotiated terms, with no childish expectation of passion flowering among account books. Yet there were moments when he thanked her too carefully, when he paused as if to say something truer and then chose restraint instead, when disappointment arrived so sharply she resented its existence. One Thursday morning she encountered the root of the house's emotional architecture in oak and polish. The main dining room table, viewed in daylight, was even more absurd than it had seemed by candlelight. 40 feet if an inch. Massive. impractical, could seat 20 and regularly silenced too. She stood at one end with her hands clasped and imagined herself old and obedient, walking that endless length for the rest of her life in silk shoes while footmen changed plates between two people who could scarcely hear each other breathe. At noon she summoned 3 footmen, the under-butler, and a carpenter. "This table is to be left for formal dinners," she said. "Beginning tomorrow, breakfast will be served in the south morning room at the round walnut table from the schoolroom corridor. The curtains are to be opened by 8. A fire lit by 7:30. Only 2 covers." The under-butler blinked. "Your Grace, His Grace has always, His Grace may continue always on ceremonial occasions. In private, I prefer conversation not requiring a telescope." The man, being well trained, converted astonishment into obedience. By the next morning the morning room held the smaller table near the hearth, laid with white china, apricot preserves, coffee, fresh bread, and a bowl of late roses clipped from the sheltered wall. Sun struck the windows. The room, which had looked merely agreeable before, now looked habitable. Eleanor sat waiting with a cup untouched before her and told herself the pounding in her chest was ridiculous. Adrian entered at precisely 8. He stopped. His gaze moved from the absent long table he had expected in the dining room to the round walnut table set for 2 in the bright morning room. Then to Eleanor. Then back to the table again, as if some hidden lever in the house had been pulled and he was trying to decide whether he had imagined the change. "You have altered breakfast," he said. "Only the geography of it." He came farther in. Morning light made him look younger, or perhaps merely less defended. "Hargreaves seems to believe I have mislaid an institution. If so, it is an institution that forced jam to travel a county before it reached one's plate. Sit down, Adrian. Unless you prefer to continue courting me from a great distance after the wedding is already concluded." The use of his given name, unplanned and lightly spoken, changed the room more than the furniture had. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, without comment, he sat opposite her at the small table where the distance between them could no longer pretend to be principal. The smaller table changed more than the room. At the long one, conversation had always felt ceremonial, as though each sentence required a servant to carry it the remaining distance. At the round walnut table, the space between them could no longer be mistaken for principle. Jam could be handed instead of requested. Silence became companionable rather than punitive. When Adrian reached for the coffee and his sleeve brushed hers, neither of them pretended not to feel it. Eleanor discovered that proximity was a form of honesty. He discovered that hunger, when acknowledged, was gentler than discipline. The first breakfast lasted 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes they spoke more honestly than they had in the previous fortnight. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in increments. The orchard wall needed rebuilding before spring. Fenwick's lower pasture might support sheep again if the ditch were cleared. Adrian hated oranges because he had once been force-fed them during a fever as a child. Eleanor admitted she read novels only after finishing practical books, because pleasure felt easiest to trust when earned. They disagreed over whether the tenants in Briar Row required stricter rent collection or more flexible planting schedules. They discovered, with equal surprise, that disagreement did not spoil appetite. When Adrian rose to leave, his fingers brushed the back of her chair in passing. The contact was brief, accidental perhaps, yet charged with more reality than any gallant phrase. Eleanor sat motionless after the door closed, one hand flat on the table as if to steady some newly loosened part of her life. That afternoon, as she sorted correspondence in the library, Adrian came in carrying a slim packet tied with blue ribbon. "For you," he said. Inside lay the Fenwick debt papers, marked paid where legitimate, disputed where predatory, and accompanied by a new deed establishing a 3-year trust for the village school. She read the pages twice before she trusted her sight. "You have done it already. I told you I would." He paused. "The trust is in your name. The schoolmistress reports you terrify accountants with unusual grace. I thought the trusteeship safer there." Something unguarded crossed her face. She knew it because he looked away too quickly, as if he had seen more gratitude than he could properly endure. "Thank you," she said, and because the room suddenly felt too full of formal words, She added more quietly, "My father would have loved you for this and argued with you over method." Adrian's answering expression was not quite a smile. "I should have valued both." It was the nearest either of them had come to naming the dead or acknowledging that their marriage had been built partly from absences carried separately. The silence after it was tender enough to frighten them both. That evening, by unspoken consent, dinner was served in the library rather than the grand dining room. Not alone, Hargreaves would have expired, but at a smaller table beside the fire. Eleanor suspected Adrian had given the order. He suspected she knew it. Neither mentioned the concession. The soup was better there. So was the company. Days lengthened into a rhythm. Work in the mornings. Estate rides when weather allowed, during which Adrian discovered that Eleanor knew tenants by family history, acreage, and grief. She remembered which child limped, whose cow had died in late spring, which widow took pride in never requesting help until help became unavoidable. He began, at first unconsciously, to ask her opinion before issuing directions. Not because she agreed with him, often she did not, but because she had a way of turning authority toward consequence that improved any decision it touched. He saw her one dusk in the lower garden examining wind damage to the espaliered pears. Gray skirts lifted clear of mud, hair darkening in the mist. She was speaking with old Mr. Weller about drainage trenches. The gardener, who took correction from noblemen as if they were rain and from women as if they were weather omens, was listening to her with respectful concentration. Adrian remained under the yews a full minute longer than necessary, arrested by the simple fact that places grew truer where she stood. He had built his life on command. Eleanor altered the world by attention. He was beginning to suspect the second gift was rarer. In the weeks after the wedding, Redhaven House taught Eleanor its rules by omission. No one told her directly that the servants watched to see whether she would assert herself with vanity or retreat into useless meekness, but she felt the question in every pause. She answered it the only way she knew, by learning names, by noticing who limped on the stairs and who watered the orange trees too sparingly, by returning a footman's apology with a practical instruction instead of wounded dignity. The staff had served beautiful women before. They had served titled women, clever women, frightened women, and cruel women. What unsettled them about Eleanor was that she saw labor as if it were a language and answered in its grammar. When the housekeeper discovered the new duchess had marked 3 wasteful coal deliveries and saved the household enough in a fortnight to restore winter broth to the servants' supper, loyalty altered shape. It was no longer duty to a name. It was allegiance to a nature. Adrian's reserve was not theatrical coldness. That would have been easier to answer because anger can be met head-on. His distance was disciplined, almost courteous, and therefore more difficult to cross. He thanked Eleanor. He consulted her. He never raised his voice. Yet he seemed always to stop one sentence earlier than honesty required, as if some private gate fell shut inside him at the first sign of wanting too much. Eleanor learned the contour of that restraint the way she had once learned the corridors of Fenwick in the dark. She knew when his mouth would flatten because a memory had interrupted him, when his shoulders stiffened because grief was near, when his politeness became a shield rather than a grace. Loving such a man, she thought in moments she refused to name as love, would not be like setting sail toward a visible shore. It would be like carrying a lantern through mist, trusting each yard of light to reveal the next. There were mornings when competence felt like a kind of prayer. Eleanor would stand in the still room with rosemary drying from the beams and the first invoices of the day spread on the table, and the world would reduce itself to solvable dimensions. Flour, soap, rents, wages, cloth, coal. Adrian found her there more than once, sleeves smooth to the wrist, plain gown fastened at the throat, hair pinned without ornament. Already 3 hours into work most ladies never saw. He began to ask her not what should be done, but why she believed it. Her explanations interested him because they never stopped at thrift. She thought first of consequence. Save on candles and the nursery seamstress might have a fire in her room. Renegotiate the orchard lease and the tenant's daughter might remain in school another winter. In her mind, management and mercy were not opposites. They were the same intelligence correctly aimed. Once, on a morning full of sleet, Adrian found the blue lantern hanging in a sheltered corner of the side passage at Redhaven. He had not asked for it. She had simply arranged for one of the old stable lanterns to be fitted with a pane of cobalt glass and kept trimmed near the outer door. For the post boys, she said, when weather turned treacherous. For the gardeners coming back late from the lower wall. For anyone who might miss the turn in bad light. He touched the cool metal frame and felt again the first astonishment she had given him. That her instinct, under pressure, was to make refuge visible. Most people, when threatened, narrowed their circle of concern until only self remained. Eleanor seemed to widen hers. He suspected that was why rooms altered around her. She behaved as though safety was something that should be shared, and furniture, customs, servants, and even stubborn men gradually yielded to the proposition. Helena claimed she visited for her godson's sake, but everyone with eyes understood she had stayed for Eleanor's. The dowager possessed a gift for assembling ordinary afternoons into occasions that invited truth. She ordered tea in the sunny schoolroom rather than the formal saloon. She set embroidery aside after 10 minutes because she despised counterfeit industry. She asked questions that sounded light and landed deep. Did Eleanor miss the smell of wet earth at Fenwick? Which room in Redhaven felt least borrowed? Had anyone ever taught Adrian the social cost of being right too often? Under that mild fire, confessions emerged smiling. Eleanor admitted that grandeur exhausted her. Helena replied that grandeur exhausted everyone sensible and had only ever been sustained by people too vain to confess it. Such irreverence loosened something in Eleanor. It became easier, after Helena, to believe that dignity and ease might coexist. When their hands met, it was usually over something practical. A ledger, teapot, a stack of correspondence, gloves left on a hall table. Yet utility made the contact more dangerous, not less, because neither of them could dismiss it as performance. At the small breakfast table his knuckles brushed hers when he reached for apricot preserve. In the library he passed her a volume and his fingers closed a half-second too long around the spine she held. Once, during an argument about whether the East tenants could spare 2 men for hedge work before the thaw, they both bent over the same map and rose too quickly, startling into silence at the intimacy of shared breath. None of it amounted to anything society would have named. Taken together, it amounted to a country being settled by slow degrees. Eleanor did not become beautiful to herself when she married a duke. That was one of the quiet mercies of the thing. She remained the same woman with the same thoughtful mouth and grave gray-blue eyes and hands capable of flour, ink, and bandages. But under Redhaven's roof she gradually ceased apologizing for taking up useful space. She asked for inventories. She proposed changes. She corrected a supplier who attempted to overcharge the nursery wing. She requested warmer curtains for the servants' passage and received them. Each small success altered posture more than vanity ever could have done. At society dinners she still wore modest gowns that refused competition, but she inhabited them differently. Not as camouflage, as truth. Adrian's affection declared itself first through attention. He noticed that Eleanor read difficult letters twice before answering them, once for the words and once for the wound hidden underneath. He noticed she always thanked the youngest footman because no one else did. He noticed she ate oranges with a knife because childhood scarcity had taught her not to waste juice on her hands. None of these observations seemed, by themselves, extraordinary. Together they became the evidence by which a man understands he is no longer merely observing a woman but building his inner life around the fact of her. He had admired beauty before. He had desired charm. What shook him now was the steadier knowledge that he trusted Eleanor's view of the world more than his own hardened habits, and that trust felt frighteningly close to peace. Rumor began, as it usually did, in voices that pretended to pity. How unfortunate, people said, that the new Duchess of Redhaven had come from such thin circumstances. How sudden the match had been. How romantic in the alarming sense. How charitable of his grace. Under the velvet of those phrases lay the old accusation that a woman without dazzling fortune or practiced coquetry must have arrived by some unclean short route. Eleanor recognized the shape of that suspicion at once because it had shadowed her in lesser ways all her life. Quiet competence in a woman was often treated as a species of concealment. If she had not advertised herself, then perhaps she had plotted. If she had not begged, then perhaps she had trapped. The lie society found hardest to believe was that dignity could exist without strategy. There were evenings when Adrian rode out alone only to return earlier than intended because the thought of the house without Eleanor in it had begun to feel physically wrong. Once he came back at dusk and saw her through the morning room glass reading to the old spaniel at her feet while rain moved across the terrace in silver threads. She was doing nothing grand, nothing one could easily recount at a club dinner. Yet the sight of her entered him with the force of revelation. He had spent years mistaking spectacle for significance because spectacle was easier to announce. Eleanor's greatness resisted announcement. It expressed itself in the steadiness with which rooms calmed around her, in the fact that frightened creatures drew near instead of away, in the nearly scandalous patience with which she allowed flawed people the chance to become better than their habits. 3 weeks after the wedding, the Dowager Duchess Helena Thorne arrived unannounced and immediately improved the house by behaving as if no one in it were sacred. She entered the drawing room in plum silk and silver lace, slender as an unsheathed opinion, kissed Adrian on one cheek, told him he looked overmanaged, then turned to Eleanor and said, "So you are the woman who made my godson marry for surprise instead of strategy." I had begun to think Providence had lost interest in him. Eleanor, who had spent the previous day preparing to be measured, judged, or delicately tolerated by yet another grand relation, stared for one hazardous second before Helena's dark eyes warmed. "Forgive me," the older woman said. "That was affection in my dialect. One must learn translations within families." Adrian actually laughed. It transformed him so suddenly Helena nodded, as if some private wager had been won. At tea she requested not the blue saloon prepared for important callers, but the sunny schoolroom overlooking the herb court. "I cannot think under guilt," she declared. "It makes every thought overdressed." There she proceeded, over hot scones and improper quantities of currant preserve, to ask Eleanor about Fenwick, village schooling, and whether Redhaven's cook had yet admitted the superiority of her mushroom broth. Not once did she ask how it felt to become a duchess overnight. Eleanor understood with gratitude, was interested in substance rather than spectacle. Helena never offered comfort in the syrupy way some older women did, as if sorrow might be coaxed into silence by pet names and sweets. Her kindness had spine. She listened fully, then answered plainly, and in that plainness Eleanor found something rarer than indulgence: respect. Helena treated her conclusions as worth engaging, her observations as useful, her restraint as a form of strength rather than social timidity. It was the first female kindness in years that did not ask Eleanor to shrink herself to earn it. Later, while Adrian rode out to inspect the north hedges, Helena found Eleanor alone in the library sorting parish requests. "You are fond of him already," the dowager said, not as a question. Eleanor's fingers stilled on the paper knife. "I respect him. That is how sensible women begin when the feeling has become too expensive to name directly. And if I did, what then?" Helena's expression gentled but did not soften into sentimentality. "Then you would be in ordinary danger. Which is to say, human danger. He is fond of you too. More than fond, I think. But Adrian has spent years teaching himself that need invites loss. Men praised for strength are often allowed too much cowardice in tenderness." Eleanor looked down at the pages before her. "He is kind. He is honorable. He has never once made me feel beholden. But sometimes I think I stand outside a locked room and hear him moving within it." Helena nodded as if this confirmed a prior diagnosis. "He has lived inside locked rooms so long he mistakes them for architecture." She reached out and tapped the page Eleanor had not turned. "Do not reward him for that confusion forever. Compassion is not the same thing as self-erasure." The advice lodged deep because it named what Eleanor had not dared articulate: that gratitude, if worn too long, could become another form of invisibility. That night, after Helena retired, Adrian came to the library with a decanter and 2 glasses he had no intention of using for more than politeness. He found Eleanor by the fire, reading without progress. "My aunt has been interrogating you," he said, "only with precision. That is her cruelest gift." He set the decanter aside untouched and remained standing, as if uncertain whether to trust the chair beside hers. "She likes you. She told me you mistake locked rooms for architecture." The words were out before she could call them back. Adrian went still. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he sat. "Helena has never believed in decorative mercy," he said. "No." Firelight moved over the side of his face. "My father was a man of public consequence and private weather. My mother learned to read storms in him the way farmers read sky. When she died, the house praised her gentleness as if gentleness had been the same thing as safety. It was not. Since then I have preferred discipline to volatility, competence to charm, quiet to display." Eleanor waited. He almost never spoke this plainly about himself. "When people want much from you," he continued, looking at the fire rather than at her, "it becomes easier to give them role, decision, provision, protection. Those things can be measured. They can be performed even when one is tired or angry or hollow. Feeling cannot. Feeling makes demands in return." She turned the book closed in her lap. "And yet you married me." Now he did look at her. There was no easy answer in his face. "Yes," he said quietly. "And every day since, the arrangement has become less arranged than I intended." Her breath caught. Neither of them moved. The room narrowed to lamplight, fire, and the unsteady fact of mutual understanding standing one step short of confession. Adrian rose first, not abruptly but with the care of a man leaving dangerous ground because he knows he may not wish to leave it later. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." When the fixed, almost absurdly prosaic interruption of the world had passed through the silence of the room like a door opening onto some other realm of listeners and time, the fire resumed its low work. Adrian gave a small, self-aware breath that might have become laughter under kinder circumstances. "It seems even truth must sometimes wait its turn," he said. Eleanor looked down so he would not see the smile he had caused. "Then we shall have to be patient with it." Patience, Eleanor discovered, is not a passive art. It asks one to endure a door standing open without forcing it wider, to trust a movement of the heart not yet named aloud, to continue arranging ordinary days while inwardly awaiting weather. For a while she managed it well. Winter came properly. Redhaven settled into its cold season life of logs, correspondence, tenant petitions, and dim afternoons brightened by the ridiculous frequency with which Adrian now contrived to encounter her over practical matters that could easily have been settled by stewards. He sought her in the library over fencing for Briar Row, in the gallery over London invitations, in the breakfast room over a question about hothouse oranges he did not care about in the least. At times she thought he approached honesty as one might approach an unfamiliar horse. Hand extended, voice calm, retreat prepared. At other times she caught him looking at her with something so unguarded that her whole body seemed to recognize it before her mind permitted itself the same privilege. They began, without decision, to share the library in the evenings. He with dispatches, she with books or estate lists, each gradually less occupied by the work actually before them than by the reassuring fact of the other's presence within the same pool of lamplight. The library at Redhaven became the truest room in the house because it permitted half-shadows. In the ballroom and drawing rooms everyone was required to know too quickly what they meant to one another. In the library there was time to discover it by increments. Through a hand pausing over the same page, through the confession of a favorite poet, through the soft laugh that escaped before manners could catch it. Eleanor had always thought intimacy must announce itself with unmistakable force, the way thunder announced weather. Instead it arrived like lamplight taking hold of a room one surface at a time. One such evening Adrian asked what she read when she wished not to improve herself. Eleanor, startled into honesty by the odd question, admitted it was poetry. Not sentimental verse, she clarified, but lines severe enough to make feeling sound respectable. That is a suspiciously elaborate distinction, he said. I have had years of practice making preferences defensible. Against whom? Against anyone who believed usefulness should occupy the whole of a woman's mind. He leaned back, studying her. And what do you believe? She considered. That usefulness is a form of love when properly aimed. But when it is made the only value in a person, it becomes another way of not seeing them. The words hung between them. Adrian's gaze sharpened as if the sentence had found a hidden seam in him. "Is that how you were treated at Fenwick?" he asked. Eleanor could have answered lightly. Instead, perhaps because the fire was low and the room mercifully private, she said often, "I was trusted with lists, not with notice. Needed, not particularly known. Those are different things." His mouth parted as if the correct response had reached him too late. "Eleanor." A knock at the door interrupted whatever would have come next. Hargreaves entered with a silver tray and a stack of London invitations thick enough to suggest that society, hearing of a new duchess from nowhere, had decided curiosity was a moral duty. Redhaven House must come to town for the winter assemblies. There was no evading it without offense. Helena, triumphant at being proved right about the entertainment value of Providence, installed herself as general in matters of wardrobe and social strategy. She refused to allow the dressmaker to force Eleanor into anything indecently theatrical. "We are not baiting a ballroom," she informed a horrified assistant. "We are dressing a woman with a spine. Cover her properly and let the foolish reveal themselves around her." Thus Eleanor's London wardrobe was made in tones of mist, soft blue, pewter, and winter rose. Long sleeves, floor-length skirts, modest square or high necklines softened by gauze or fichu. Nothing that competed for victory in the vulgar contest of who could sparkle loudest. Helena approved every piece. Adrian, who was wisely absent during fittings, saw the results later and said very little, which in him often meant too much. London in December had a way of making important smell faintly of coal smoke. Redhaven House in Grosvenor Square filled by degrees with flowers, cards, callers, and newsprint references to the sudden marriage that had rescued a provincial gentlewoman from obscurity and puzzled half the capital. Eleanor entered that world with the steady caution of someone stepping onto new ice. She had expected splendor and malice. She had not expected their intimacy. In grand rooms lined with mirrors and candlelight, every smile seemed to have a second purpose. Lady Rosamund Belgrave made her first approach at a musicale hosted by the Countess of Danby. She was beautiful in the severe, controlled way polished marble is beautiful. Black hair arranged in elaborate curls, dark eyes that suggested private amusement at everyone else's expense. Mouth too proud to soften often and therefore more striking when it did. Her gown was deep crimson with long sleeves, cut impeccably within fashion and chosen with full knowledge of what strong color could do in a candlelit room. She greeted Adrian with a smile that belonged to old familiarity and turned to Eleanor with one designed for witnesses. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head, "what a singular pleasure to meet the heroine of the season's swiftest romance. We had all been wondering what sort of courage it takes to marry a duke between storms and breakfast." Around them conversation thinned. Eleanor heard the trap open under velvet. "Only the practical kind," she said. The weather discouraged longer engagements. A flicker, surprise, annoyance, interest, crossed Rosamund's face before elegance recovered the ground. How fortunate that the weather was so obliging. Adrian stepped in then with a politeness more dangerous than rebuke. "Rosamund, if you intend to interview my wife, at least offer her champagne first. Society should preserve forms where it can." The listeners laughed. Rosamund smiled. Yet as she turned away, the look she gave Eleanor was no longer merely curious. It was wounded, measuring, and very nearly angry. Helena, observing from a sofa with the expression of a general who has identified the opposing artillery, murmured later, that one was bred to believe rank was a harvest and your husband part of the land promised her. "She is not evil, my dear. She is cornered. Cornered people often become inventive in unforgivable directions." Proved the most accurate warning Eleanor received all winter. At first Rosamund's injuries were subtle enough to be deniable. An invitation addressed to the Duchess of Ravensden instead of Redhaven. A supper seating that placed Eleanor between a deaf bishop and a man who believed county drainage superior to women. A remark, delicately uttered within hearing, about the charming simplicity of ladies raised too far from town to learn certain refinements. Each insult was small. That was its power. Objecting to smallness makes a woman seem vain. Enduring it makes others believe it does not cut. Adrian saw more than Eleanor wished him to see. At a winter musicale, when a chair had been omitted from the row reserved for their party, he fetched one himself from the wall and placed it at his wife's side before 3 countesses and 2 viscounts could pretend the oversight had been innocent. At a dinner where a guest praised Eleanor's rural tranquility with the tone one uses for an improved dairy cow, Adrian replied that his duchess's figures had corrected a government surveyor the previous month and that London might prosper if more of its ornaments knew arithmetic. The man laughed uncertainly. The table learned caution. But protection offered in fragments only sharpened Eleanor's awareness of the moments he remained silent. He would defend her from others. He had not yet fully opened the locked room to her. One morning in January, snow began before dawn and did not stop by noon. Snow changed judgment by changing sound. Wheels were quieter, voices carried less, and even London seemed briefly capable of mercy under its pale coverlet. Eleanor liked winter for that reason. It imposed hush on places that had mistaken noise for importance. From the windows of Redhaven House she watched the street whiten and thought of the night Adrian had come to her in rain. Storm had introduced them in violence. Snow now kept them in suspension, as if the world itself had paused to see whether 2 guarded people would finally tell each other the truth. By afternoon the city had muffled itself into a whitened quiet more profound than any ball could achieve. Helena napped. Hargreaves argued with a coal merchant in the hall. Adrian returned early from Whitehall with snow on his shoulders and found Eleanor in the morning room stringing dried orange slices for the children's ward at Fenwick School. "You should not trust London children with fire and citrus at the same festival," he said, removing his gloves. "Then I shall trust them with wonder and let the teachers manage combustion." He stood watching her longer than the observation required. At last he crossed the room and took the chair beside her, not opposite. The movement was so simple and so deliberate that Eleanor's pulse altered. "There is something I owe you," he said. She set down the thread. His voice held the gravity of promised truth. "When I told you at Fenwick that I came to inspect the estate because of your accounts, I spoke only the useful half. The other half began 3 years earlier with a letter from your father." He drew a folded page from his coat. Time had softened the edges. "I have carried this since the quarter sessions at Narm." He wrote of a boundary matter, then mentioned you. He said you saw what others overlooked. He said life would punish or reward you heavily for it, and that he hoped, at least once, to see it rewarded. When Fenwick's distress crossed my desk, I remembered the line. I rode there intending to judge land, yes, but also to judge whether he had seen you rightly. Eleanor took the letter with careful fingers. Her father's hand rose to meet her from the page, upright and decisive even in ink. She read the familiar severity softened by private pride and had to look down for fear of what Adrian might witness on her face. "You should have told me sooner," she said at last. "I know. Instead you let me believe your interest began with necessity, with land, with scandal." The hurt in her voice surprised them both by its force. "Do you know what it is to be studied and selected from a distance, Adrian? To find that one more person had measured your usefulness before your person?" He flinched as if the words had touched the cut in his hand anew. "That was not what I meant. It may not be what you meant. It is what I have lived." He rose and went to the window, one hand braced against the casing. Outside, snow thickened the square into whiteness. Inside, the room held too much truth for either of them to step carelessly. From his perspective, the moment felt like the exact consequence Helena would have predicted, and he had still been arrogant enough to imagine he might avoid. He had prized timing above confession, control above vulnerability, and now the woman he loved. There was no avoiding the word any longer, not with his chest tightening around it. Stood before him wounded not by what he had seen in her but by the manner in which he had hidden the seeing. He had spent months honoring her dignity in every measurable way while failing to grasp that silence itself could become a form of condescension when it withheld the very fact of recognition she most deserved to hear. "I did not marry you because your father praised you," he said. "No, you married me because circumstances made it efficient." He turned. "I married you because the moment you opened that door I recognized a kind of courage I had been looking for without admitting it. The letter only made me capable of seeing what was already before me." "Then why am I hearing this now?" Because I am a coward where tenderness is concerned, he thought. Because protection is easier than disclosure. Because I believed proving might excuse withholding. Yet the words that reached air were less naked. Because I feared making you feel observed instead of cherished. And because by the time I understood the difference, delay had become its own cowardice. Eleanor folded the letter again with reverent accuracy. At last a truth I can work with, she said, though tears brightened her eyes. Leave me for a little while, if you please. I would rather think kindly of you than speak rashly. He bowed once, a gesture almost formal in its grief, and went. The days that followed were not cold in the old formal sense. They were worse because warmth had already been tasted. Adrian remained attentive, respectful, visibly tormented by restraint. Eleanor remained composed, wounded less by deception than by the realization that even being seen could arrive wrapped in fear. Helena, informed of nothing directly, looked at both of them across breakfast and muttered that some people deserved to be sent into weather without coats until they learned the use of plain language. Meanwhile Rosamund, who possessed a talent for sensing fractures she had not caused, became bolder. A note purportedly from a country cousin reached one matron, then another, wondering whether the Duchess of Redhaven had known the Duke's identity before sheltering him. A former maid from Fenwick, dismissed months earlier for pilfering ribbon and lamp oil, was paid to repeat in selective company that Miss Marlowe had been very eager to receive a mysterious gentleman at uncommon hours. A ridiculous charge, yet gossip feeds best where dignity refuses to soil itself by answering. Within a fortnight the story had acquired accessories. A hidden signal lamp, a planned encounter, a prior correspondence no one could produce. When Adrian heard, his anger did not erupt. Condensed. He sent Lennox quietly to Fenwick. He asked Hargreaves questions so measured the butler went pale. He attended 2 dinners he would gladly have avoided simply to look more closely at who repeated what and with what confidence. In private he told Eleanor only that some tongues had been hired and he meant to learn whose purse had opened. She believed him. She did not, however, mistake investigation for the fuller healing still absent between them. The invitation to the winter assembly at Carlton House arrived embossed, unavoidable, and ominously public. Every notable person in London would attend. Music, dancing, politics, rivalries, and charitable displays would all be arranged beneath enough candlelight to flatter lies into brilliance. Helena declared it either the perfect place for a final attack or a perfect place to survive one. Adrian said little, which made Eleanor certain he expected trouble. On the afternoon of the assembly, her maid laid out 2 gowns. One crimson silk recently altered by an enthusiastic modiste who mistook triumph for volume, and one smoke blue satin with a modest square neckline softened by gauze, long fitted sleeves, and a skirt that moved with grave fluidity rather than sparkle. Eleanor looked at both and thought of Rosamund's appetite for contest. Then she set the crimson aside. She chose the smoke blue. When Adrian entered the dressing-room threshold to ask whether the carriage was ready, he stopped as he had stopped on the morning he first saw the breakfast table changed. Recognition crossed his face, but this time it held admiration too direct to hide. "You look," he said, and the old caution nearly claimed the rest. Helena, fastening a bracelet behind Eleanor's wrist, supplied it dryly. "If you say presentable, Adrian, I shall disinherit you in a way not recognized by law but deeply satisfying to me personally." A slow color touched his cheekbones. He met Eleanor's eyes in the mirror. "You look like yourself," he said at last, "which is the highest praise I know how to offer." It was not a ballroom compliment. It was something better. Steadied her. The winter assembly glittered with such force that for a moment it seemed possible the whole kingdom had been melted into chandeliers and mirrors. Music moved through the rooms in polished currents. Courtiers, politicians, heiresses, dowagers, generals, and younger sons filled the floor in practiced patterns. Yet beneath the grandeur Eleanor sensed appetite sharper than elegance. People came to such gatherings not merely to be seen, but to decide what everyone else's visibility would cost. She and Adrian had scarcely completed the first circuit of the rooms before the air changed. Not visibly, not yet, but clusters quieted half a beat as they passed. Heads turned in the ripple pattern of news advancing ahead of its own proof. Rosamund stood near the central salon in plum-black silk, one gloved hand resting on the back of a gilt chair like a general keeping contact with her artillery. Beside her were her mother, Lady Belgrave, and three women whose expressions suggested moral excitement. In Lady Belgrave's hand lay a folded paper. Adrian saw it at the same moment Eleanor did. "Stay by me," he said quietly. "I had intended to." Rosamund smiled as they approached. No softness lived in it now. Only injured resolve polished into performance. "Your Grace," she said to Adrian. Then, to the room at large rather than to Eleanor, "I had prayed this unpleasantness might be resolved privately. But since false innocence grows bold when indulged, I cannot in conscience remain silent." Conversations around them failed altogether. Lady Belgrave lifted the folded paper. "This note, received from a former servant of Fenwick House, describes signals made from the Marlowe window on the night His Grace was so conveniently stranded. It suggests the lady now styled Duchess had reason to expect a gentleman caller and motive to entangle him. She let the word entangle fall slowly, expertly. There are also statements regarding debts and certain promises made if a title were secured. The cruelty of such scenes is rarely in the allegation itself. It is in the room's willingness to inhale before truth is known. Eleanor felt that inhale around her then. A collective tightening of curiosity, pity, malice, and relief that someone else's humiliation had arrived to entertain the evening. Rosamund stepped closer. Her dark eyes were bright, almost fevered. "You see, I was taught to respect marriage, even unexpected marriage. But society cannot be asked to honor what was purchased through trickery. Not even for a duke." For one dangerous instant Eleanor understood everything Helena had said about cornered people. This was not random spite. Rosamund had built her future for years around a match everyone assumed inevitable. To lose Adrian was one blow. To lose him to an unknown woman whose very plainness made the loss look like judgment was another. Wounded pride, fear, public embarrassment, maternal pressure, the ingredients of cruelty were all present and legible. They did not excuse her, but they explained why she had chosen destruction over shame. Eleanor lifted her chin. "If you wished only to display your disappointment, Lady Rosamund, a less crowded room would have sufficed." A few listeners gasped. Adrian did not move, yet she sensed, as one senses heat before flame, that something in him had reached its limit. Rosamund laughed sharply. "Disappointment? No. Correction. There are rules by which women of decent conduct live. A lady does not lure men under cover of weather. A lady does not barter obscure gentility for ducal rescue. A lady does not." "Enough," Adrian said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The single word cut the room cleanly in half. Lady Belgrave drew herself up. "Surely, Your Grace, you cannot wish this suppressed if there is any stain upon your house." "Upon my house?" Adrian turned then, not to them first but to the wider ring of listeners, and Eleanor saw his face assume the terrible calm of a man who has finished fearing what truth will cost him. "Very well. Let us have stains inspected in proper order. Captain Lennox." Lennox appeared from the crowd as if conjured by preparedness itself, carrying a leather dispatch case. Behind him came Mrs. Bailey from Fenwick, the dismissed maid white-faced at her side, and, to audible astonishment, Penhist of Penhist Bale holding his hat as though it might protect him from public ruin. Rosamund's color changed. So did her mother's. Adrian took the folded note from Lady Belgrave's hand, glanced at it once, and passed it to Lennox. "Forged. The handwriting imitates a servant dismissed from Fenwick in October. She has now admitted, in the presence of a magistrate, that she was paid through an intermediary to repeat a false account of that night. The intermediary was traced to Lady Belgrave's steward. As for debts, Mr. Penhist is here to explain which claims upon Fenwick were legitimate and which were inflated in expectation of distress. He has also brought the letters by which certain persons encouraged him to speak freely in drawing-rooms about Miss Marlowe's supposed desperation." Penhist began sweating invisible rivulets. Lady Belgrave inhaled as if scandal were acceptable only when directed outward. Rosamund recovered first. This proves nothing except that frightened servants lie and attorneys scavenge. It does not change what everyone sees. An obscure woman took in a stranger, and by morning she had a duke. That was the final blow, and in a strange way it was useful. It stripped the scene to its true argument. Not about forged papers or servants, but about who was considered worthy of being believed. Adrian stepped forward until he stood between Eleanor and the crowd, not shielding her from sight but commanding the sight itself. When he spoke again, the whole room listened with the animal stillness audiences keep for either executions or revelations. "You wish to know why I married my wife," he said. "Then hear it from the only person with a right to answer. I did not choose her because she was easy to display. I did not choose her because society approved. I did not choose her because she knew my title, my income, or the reach of my name. I did not choose her because a storm trapped me. I did not choose her because convenience demanded a bride." Each sentence struck harder than a raised voice might have done. The repeated structure gathered force like steps toward a precipice. "I chose her because when the road had failed, she lit a lantern for strangers anyway. I chose her because in a house under debt and whether she made room, bound a wound, and asked nothing in return. I chose her because she sees what other people overlook and then labors to save it without advertising her mercy. I chose her because every room she enters grows more honest. I chose her because where other people perform kindness, she practices it. I chose her because she turned protection outward even when her own life had offered her too little of it." No one moved. He turned slightly then, not away from the crowd but toward Eleanor, as if the public declaration were useless without the private truth embedded in it. "And if any of you mistake plain dress for plain worth, or quiet for emptiness, the failure is yours, not hers. You saw obscurity and assumed it meant insignificance. I saw a woman who held a collapsing house together with competence, dignity, and more courage than most titled people manage in perfect comfort. The kingdom knows her name now because I will speak it wherever honor matters, and because she was worthy of being seen long before any of you thought to look. There it was. Not rescue. Recognition finally made public and unmistakable." Rosamund's expression broke not into melodrama but into something smaller and sadder. The naked knowledge that she had staked her future on a system that measured women by glitter and lineage, only to discover that one quiet woman had invalidated the arithmetic. Lady Belgrave drew her back with a hand that trembled. They did not protest again. They could not. Truth, properly armed, leaves very little air for vanity. Adrian was not finished. His gaze settled on Rosamund, and though his voice gentled by a shade, it did not pardon. "Your grievance is legible, Lady Rosamund. You were taught to build your safety on a match others discussed as destiny. That training was its own cruelty. But the humiliation of expectation does not entitle anyone to forge shame for another woman. Explanation is not absolution. Remember the difference." Rosamund lowered her eyes. Whether from remorse, defeat, or mere incapacity to withstand public witness, Eleanor could not tell. Perhaps all three. In another life they might have pitied each other. In this one pity had arrived too late to prevent harm. The Prince Regent's private secretary, who had hovered near the music room doors uncertain whether intervention would worsen scandal, stepped forward then with the skill of a man practiced in turning disaster back into courtly weather. The orchestra, after a discreet pause, began again in the adjoining salon. Conversations resumed in a chastened murmur. Society, having been fed and rebuked in equal measure, moved on as it always does. Adrian held out his hand. "Come away with me," he said. Eleanor placed her fingers in his. The contact, before all those eyes, felt oddly intimate. He led her not to the ballroom center but through a side gallery, past a line of winter camellias, and into a glass-walled conservatory lit by 2 lamps and the pale reflection of snow beyond the panes. There, at last, there was no audience. For a long moment neither spoke. Their reflections stood faintly in the glass among bare branches and dark leaves. The world outside was white with snowfall. Inside, the air smelled of earth and roses kept alive against season. "I should have said it sooner," Adrian said at last. The fierceness of the ballroom had left his voice. What remained was simpler, more difficult. Not because tonight required a speech, but because you required the truth long before strangers did. I saw you, Eleanor. I saw you from the first night, and before that in traces through your father's respect. Then I hid behind usefulness because I knew how to provide it and did not know how to risk more. Tears rose so quickly she had to laugh once in self-defense. You are infuriatingly eloquent when threatened by half the kingdom. I am trying to become eloquent when threatened by one honest woman. She looked at him through blurred lashes. That will require more courage. I know. He took one step nearer. May I try anyway? Yes. The word changed him, not visibly to anyone careless. But Eleanor had learned by then how much of Adrian lived in increments. He exhaled as if he had been holding breath since the storm night. He lifted a hand, not to command, not to guide, simply to touch the line of her cheek with a reverence that made her eyes close. I love you, he said. No declaración. No title. No strategy. Not because you saved my pride that night, though you did. Not because you improved my house, though every corner of it bears your intelligence. Not because you are good enough for a duchess's role. I love you because you are yourself in a world forever instructing women to become performances, and because being seen by you has made me less willing to live half-hidden from my own heart. She had thought she might answer him with equal composure. Instead, relief moved through her so powerfully it felt like grief leaving. I love you too, she whispered, though I disliked the speed with which I was required to arrive there. His laughter broke softly against her mouth because at that exact moment he bent and kissed her. It was not a theatrical kiss. No audience waited. No music swelled helpfully to dignify it. It was better than spectacle for precisely that reason. It felt like the first entirely private truth they had ever shared. His gloved hand came away so he could touch her more carefully. Her fingers caught in the front of his coat. Outside, snow whitened the city. Inside, the long cold architecture between them finally gave way. He rested his forehead briefly against hers afterward. There is a dance still owed you, he said. In the middle of a scandal's funeral? Especially then. He led her back not into the largest room but into a side salon where the musicians, sensing perhaps that history prefers witnesses kept discreetly at a distance, had taken up a slower measure. They danced almost alone. No one intruded. Eleanor laid her hand in his and felt, for the first time since the storm, not rescued, not installed, not defended, but companioned. When he drew her a fraction closer at the turn, it seemed the whole winter had been waiting for that precise correction of distance. Spring came early the following year, and with it the sort of soft green that makes even old grievances look less permanent. By April, Blue Lantern House stood completed on the Fenwick Road where travelers most often lost direction in bad weather. It had been Eleanor's idea and Adrian's insistence that the idea be funded without half measures. A modest refuge with 6 clean rooms, a hot kitchen, 2 chambers reserved for widows in temporary need, and a schoolroom annex where Mrs. Bailey now taught village girls accounts alongside reading. Above the porch hung a lantern with cobalt glass bright enough to be seen from the turn by the yews. Fenwick's roofs were sound. The school had coal. Briar Rose drainage had been rebuilt. Mrs. Valeria, comfortably settled in Bath on her negotiated income, wrote long letters describing acquaintances as if she had personally improved them. Helena divided her time between Redhaven and London, claiming the country sharpened her sarcasm. Hargreaves adapted to breakfast-table intimacy by deciding it had always been a mark of ancient refinement. Mrs. Greeley, once cautious, now consulted Eleanor on every significant household matter with the frank respect of one commander to another. As for Rosamond, she withdrew from the center of the season after the assembly and traveled with her mother to the continent. Adrian chose not to pursue harsher punishment once the forgery was exposed and the public correction complete. Cruelty explained by fear was still cruelty, but he had no wish to make spectacle of a woman already undone by the false arithmetic that had taught her worth must be won by possession. Eleanor agreed. Mercy, she had long believed, was most meaningful when it did not require forgetfulness. A year to the week after the storm, villagers gathered before Blue Lantern House for its formal opening. The sky threatened rain in the tender, undecided way of early spring. Children ran between carts. Mrs. Bailey cried again, as she did at every important improvement. Adrian stood beside Eleanor on the porch while the cobalt glass caught the late afternoon light and threw a small blue wash across the new whitewashed wall. Lennox handed Adrian a pair of shears for the ribbon. Adrian passed them directly to Eleanor. "It was your lantern first," he said. Murmurs of approval passed through the crowd. Once, such public attention would have made her instinctively seek a corner. Now she looked out at the villagers, the repaired road, the women with baskets on their arms, the children already peering into the schoolroom windows, and felt no urge to disappear. Her smoke-blue gown that day was simple, long-sleeved, and practical enough for wind. Adrian's hand rested warm at the small of her back, not to possess but to reassure. She cut the ribbon. Applause broke over the yard like kind weather. That evening, after the guests had gone and the first lamps were lit in the refuge windows, she and Adrian walked alone to the U-turn where the road dipped and the lantern could best be seen. The air smelled of wet grass and coal smoke and the first opened earth of spring. Behind them the house glowed steadily in the coming dark. "My father used to say that any house with light owed some part of it to the lost," Eleanor said. Adrian took her hand. He was right. She looked up at the lantern, then at the man beside her, and thought how strange it was that the night which had once threatened to erase her had instead become the night by which her life was named. He seemed to follow the thought. "A year ago," he said, "you lifted a blue lantern for a stranger because you could not bear to let someone vanish in weather. I think that was the first moment I understood what the rest of us had been missing." She smiled. "And now the rest of the kingdom is merely catching up." They stood there until the first true rain began, soft and unthreatening, and turned together toward the warm windows waiting down the road. She had once been needed without being known, useful without being cherished, present without being fully perceived. But the storm had brought to her door the one man capable of learning that love is not rescue, not arrangement, not even protection at its most honorable. Love is the courage to see clearly and to say, before the whole world if necessary, that what others overlooked was precious all along. And somewhere in another rain-dark county, a governess was about to open her door to a viscount traveling under a false name. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.